Yeah, then welcome everyone to our opening of our installation, Connect Sudan. And first of all, a huge thank you to AL.Berlin for giving us the space, for hosting us for like 10 days now, I think. So after this info session, you're all invited to go downstairs to the basement and see our installation. If you have any questions, we will be here after and also during the next days. Probably not 24/7, but as much as we can. Then, yeah, warm welcome to everyone, and especially our guests, Muzan and Magdi, who are joining us online. Muzan from Sudan, and I think Magdi is in Europe somewhere. So I would like to introduce the two of you, and I just copy pasted some of the bios that are always below your articles. So Muzan and Alneel is a writer and public speaker with an interdisciplinary professional and academic background. She is co-founder of the Innovation, Science and Technology think tank for people-centered development in Sudan, and is a non-resident fellow of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, focusing on a people-centric approach to economy, industry, and the environment in Sudan. Muzan, I hope that's okay, and that was well described. Perfect. And then we have Gizouli. He's a scholar of the Sudans and a fellow of the Rift Valley Institute. He writes on Sudanese affairs, often on his blog, Still Sudan, which you can all follow. And he's currently working on a joint book project with Edward Thomas dealing with market authoritarianism and political Islam in Sudan. Magdi, that's also okay? Or you want to
that's more than enough. That's okay. Way too much.
That's way too much. Yeah, I wasn't sure how to keep it short. So now for the setting, we have prepared some questions for Muzan and Magdi, and yeah, we're looking forward to their input, and would then open the space for questions from all of us. Magdi, you just said you have to leave at 8, so let's try to move forward in time so we can at least ask you some of the questions. However, if there's any urgent question in between or you cannot follow, just let us know, and I think it's okay to also ask some questions in between. And yeah, so although the digital space doesn't really allow us, let's try to have an open discussion and everything. Okay, that's better. Since Muzan and Magdi have written numerous articles on the Sudanese history and the revolution, I'm trying to wrap it up very quickly to just get everyone on board. And then we can start with some questions and input. Muzan, Magdi, if there's anything I forget now or you think is very important in the timeline, please also add it. So because, I mean, SudanUprising itself, or our group in Germany has started, I think, early winter 2019, following the protests that broke out in Sudan, that were an answer to the 30-year military dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir and his Islamist military dictatorship of the National Congress Party. And then in 2018, in December, what we now call the December Revolution started and led to the military coup against Bashir in April 2019. And then, so the military toppled him somehow and put itself up as the Transitional Military Council, running throughout the next month. Especially, I mean, not especially, but to highlight here, we have to at least mention the Khartoum massacre on the 3rd of June, 2019, which I think was one of the darkest days of the revolution yet. And after 2 months more, in August 2019, there was an agreement made with the Transitional Military Council that led to this transitional government. and that announced Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok as transitional prime minister. And then in October 2020, the Juba Peace Agreement joined the Juba partners, which are, I don't like this term, but the rebel groups in Sudan, like mainly from Darfur and South Kordofan, to this transitional government somehow, and it also extended the transitional period. And then, we're in October 2021, where you all heard that, Hamdok was arrested, and the military had a coup again. And then last Sunday, Hamdok was reinstated as prime minister, and now we're at this point that's very crucial. However, I have to I have to say that during this, after the agreement in 2019, so August 2019, until today, actually, people have been going out protesting, and it's been a constant struggle against this transitional period, because there's also voices who say, like, we don't accept this military deal. They didn't accept it in 2019, and now it's a proof why, actually. So I hope that was a wrap up of everything. And of course, we want to focus especially on the last point. And now the first question maybe to Muzan would be, what is the difference between the protests that happened recently, so after the 25th of October, and the protests starting in December 2018? What are the demands of the people, and who are the driving forces behind these protests? Yes, Muzan, please.
Well, I would say that the main difference is who's leading those protests and who's organizing them, and the kind of the relationship between those leading and organizing the protests and the masses in general. The protests right now are being organized and called for by the neighborhood resistance committees. Neighborhood resistance committees were formed, the current neighborhood resistance committees were formed. Most of them started in January, February 2019, due to a call from the Sudanese Professional Association, which was leading the protest back then. They needed a less centralized manner of organizing protests on the ground due to the security situation, and they called for the formation of the resistance committees. The resistance committees evolved over the 2 years of the protest, and then the transitional government, and took on other roles. The government tried to co-opt them to take on a role of service provision, while they kept on evolving more into becoming an amplifier of the voices of the streets in some way, if one could say, given that the government the transitional government did not work in any way in creating any channels of participation, democratic participation in decision making and in the political process. Basically, the only way to talk to the government was to protest. And over the 2 years of the transitional government, I cannot say that a full week passed without some kind of a march by some resistance committee or some group of resistance committees due to one demand or the other not being heard by the government. Over this time, the resistance committees they built themselves basically organizationally. They evolved, and also their links to their constituency, one can say, grew and evolved. Maybe also the times during which the government tried to turn them into fully service provision bodies helped in that as they worked with their neighborhood, whether it is to distribute bread at times of shortage or other issues. So right now the protests are being organized by those resistance committees, and we can see that reflects on the type of protest that we're seeing. It reflects on the demands, as in it's no longer one schedule that comes out from the SPA, and every resistance committee is basically executing it, but we're seeing different schedules coming from different resistance committees, and it's clear that there is some sort of coordination, as within every week there is at least a day or two that is a joint action, whether it is the night of the barricades or a Millions March or so on. That is the main difference, and I think that's also made the reaction to the announcement of the New Deal very different from the reaction to the announcement of the last deal. While the deal between the FFC and the coup leaders at the time was people waited to see what the FFC or specifically what the SPA would say and followed on that. And actually the SPA and the FFC at the time played it much better with their messaging was much better in getting people on their side. But also this time we saw that people took liberty to take their own political decision. The timing also helped, as the announcement was made during a march. A march was already taking place, a previously organized march, not related to the announcement. But once the announcement was made, there was a sort of a process of consensus building, popular consensus building that happened basically by chance, and led to everybody starting to chant against the agreement and against the prime minister. The demands of the resistance committees, to some extent they are more radical than those of the protests led by the SPA, given that a clear demand for removal of the military from the political process is a step ahead. But other than that, they're more elaborate, more detailed, maybe, but they are not exactly. This nature of being more radical is not reflected in each and every side of the demands. Just the one clear thing regarding the military, since people experienced it and have a clear position regarding it. But again, given that we're talking about neighborhood committees, so they're based on geographic structure, and I believe it's difficult to get radical on geography based on geography. So that is maybe the one weakness of the resistance committees. But other than that, we're seeing them way more committed to their demands than the SPA was, definitely.
Okay, thank you so much. One question I've been also always asking myself, especially after or since August 29, is that people often talk about how few years Sudan has been governed democratically since independence, and how would the period of the transitional government in 50 years or whenever in the future will actually be seen as a democratic period or not, and yeah, how do people on the ground see it? Like, how do they see the last 2 years? How would they assess them? Magdi or Muzan, maybe, whoever wants.
Oh, I can't answer that question.
Because it's in the future. Yeah, I know that's quite tricky. Muzan, maybe.
I don't do futures. I just do history.
But then maybe how
well,
would
I know it's difficult to see it as a democratic process, as a democratic period right now. It's very difficult to see that a period where regulations were drafted in closed rooms and basically passed by a number of 20-some men in a room, which is the Sovereign Council plus the cabinet that became the legislative council or the parliament, waiting for the parliament to be formed. That was never formed. It's very difficult to imagine how that can be seen as a democratic one. Not necessarily, I do not necessarily think that post-revolution periods need to be democratic. I think they need to be evaluated by how much they align with the revolutionary goals, and that is not always a democratic process, but I don't think it was neither democratic nor revolutionary.
All right, that's a very clear answer. Thank you. Magdi, in one of your articles, I think the one published in Spectrum magazine, you wrote that the transitional period started off as a Faustian pact between the leaders of Sudan's military militia security complex and the FFC. And then the Juba deal introduced a third party to what was initially conceived as a bilateral accommodation. And now Al-Burhan's coup swapped out the FFC politicians in favor of the Juba partners. Now that Hamdok was released and reinstated, most of his ministers handed in their resignation, if I'm not mistaken. So besides Burhan, Hemeti, and the Juba partners, and Hamdok, obviously, who's left in the transitional government now, and what is to be expected of this coalition?
That's a good question. I think to answer it properly, you need to go beyond the names you just said.
Please.
Which are interesting names, but they're placeholders. They're placeholders for wider structures. I think, to my eyes, this is sort of conservative Sudan taking a shot at whoever attempted to upturn this system. So you can see an alliance that involves a lot of business interests. You can see a lot of merchant capital. You can see people from the Sufi world, which is essentially the merchant world. So the Sufi merchant duality is important. Most of these are prominent businessmen. Because the Sufi order doubles as a business network, it does the same function. And you can see figures from what was once upon a time called the native administration, which are sort of community leaders of a patriarchal bent, so people from Sudan's long record of patriarchy. And even the voices you hear on television, the people that Muzan likes to make fun of all the time, these old generals and retired officers and so on, this is patriarchal Sudan. This is the Sudan that's a bit upset that the type of people you're seeing on the streets are at all having a voice. And they want to return to normality. Now, you mentioned the military complex, and that's a very important thing, because that's the heart of this whole problem. The heart of this problem, in my eyes, is that production systems in Sudan are now heavily militarized. The contribution of the city, Khartoum and other cities, to gross domestic product is minimal. It's basically two items: telecommunication services and flight tickets. The type of money people like myself spend when we buy flight tickets to leave, to go in and go out, or most of the younger population in Khartoum will spend money on telecommunication. This is the city's contribution to the GDP. The rest of Sudan's money comes from the countryside, and the system of production in the countryside is heavily reliant now on the military. Once upon a time, it relied on more ideological means. They were also violent means, but they had more ideology in them. They involved religion, tribal relations, Sufi beliefs, and so on, sort of submission to some sort of higher order. Now they rely on guns. And I think the people who control the guns decide what to do with the money. There was a bit of a contradiction in the transition period that the people in government want to spend money that they do not contribute in making. They don't make the money. The money comes from the countryside. It's run by these generals. I mean, of course, ultimately the money goes back to the producers, but the people who are in control of that production system is this militia. And this is the reason why they feel justified in whatever they do. And in essence, they are securing the interests of the entire ruling bloc. That's why somebody like Hamdok would eventually toe the line, like he did. that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. These are the interests of the ruling bloc. It's not about his private commitment to whatever democracy ideals, etc. That doesn't matter. The overarching interests of the ruling bloc is to sustain this system. That's the only way it works right now. If you want to overcome that system, in my eyes, that's a long shot. This is a system that has been evolving since the 17th century almost. So if you want to get beyond that, you need to sort of think very deeply, how will you bind the type of courageous efforts that are happening on Khartoum streets with rural problems? These two domains are not in sync now. They speak different languages, they have different issues, they organize differently, and their struggles are unrelated to each other at the moment. And I think, and this is an old issue in Sudan's left, that's not just me being clever. It's like there are many much more clever people who thought about this before. And there are texts in the 1960s written by Abdel Khalik Mahyoub when he contemplates why did the October Revolution fail? And it failed almost on similar premises like the ones we are experiencing now. And one very important idea he brought through often in a sort of an obscure text that people rarely read, a party document from 1970, where he argues that the reason why the October Revolution failed is that it didn't democratize rural life. It offered no formula for the democratization of rural life. You can then contemplate, what does that mean, democratization of rural life? For somebody who's for a woman who's married to who does domestic labor, no, not domestic labor, who does agricultural labor in Kordofan, for instance, which is where most of sesame production is happening today in Sudan, for instance, where most of that money is coming from. Democratizing rural life would mean that she would have a say in deciding how that process unfolds. The relation of productions that involve her and some landowner have to be altered. That's what it means. It's not about electoral systems. It's not restricted to electoral systems, I mean, you can have electoral systems, fair and nice, but if that process of democratization does not involve these relations, then it's unlikely that you will bind these struggles. Because in the city, structurally, I mean, this is not against persons, structurally, the interest of the city to get as much money as possible from the countryside, which means hyper-exploiting the poor producers of Kordofan in order to make bread affordable in a city like Khartoum. To make that possible, you need to hyper-exploit in Darfur and Kordofan using military might. That's why the military might even be astonished. Why are these kids upset anyway? We're just trying, we're trying to secure the system that sustains the well-being of the city. We understand that system better than they do. They will fail in running it because this system involves a lot of violence. If you want to get one, like in the past 6 months in Sudan made $1 billion from the export of gold. This was exported to one country, the UAE. It defined the price. And this is open access statistics. It's nothing I made. It's something any one of you can access. The Bank of Sudan reports. Now, gold production happens in marginal zones in northern Sudan, in Kordofan, in the Nuba Mountains, and it's done by the poorest people in the country, people who are running away from the hyper-exploitation of agriculture. And for them, mining is an opportunity to make a quick buck if they succeed. Of course, the people who make a quick buck are very few. The majority will continue digging without getting anything. And this system is extremely exploitative. It depends on relations of production. I've seen some of that in South Darfur. It depends on relations of production that are very close to bondage, if they are not like bondage. You actually work with your belly. You don't get paid. You're paid in food. So you work on your tummy, which is more like, and then if you take a loan from your employer, then you're in a debt relationship. You become you become indentured labor. This is bondage, more or less. So you work to pay off the debt, which is a very minor debt. It could be a few less than $100 that you took off to pay the medicine of a kid back home, and you took credit from your employer, and then you have to work to pay off that credit. So these are indentured relations, and that's some of the labor happening in the gold production is in my eyes, it's indentured labor. And then it will be, and then you see how exploitative that system is. This system allows Khartoum to make a bit of money and support the purchase of wheat in the city. So you need to think how would you relate these struggles to each other? How would you relate the struggle of a miner in Kordofan with the demands of the young men in Khartoum streets? How would that work? Without that combination, the ruling class can always mobilize things like race, ethnicity, city-country divisions against you, which is what happened in the recent turn. The ideological tool that the counter-revolution used was like, you posh city boys, we're the people from the countryside, we're the pumpkins, and you made fun of us and you laughed at us, and you are actually not even from here, and you're all foreigners and you're foreign educated, and then came this argument about it was all a bit, and it sounded very much like some of the 60s argument about Sahsouh, about the fine boys from the city who were sort of monopolizing power. So there is a lot of that in that context, and people were mocking new entrants into politics. So they were mocking them for their poor dress and terrible manners and incapacity to talk eloquently and so on. These are, to be very blunt, racist arguments. So you fell into the trap of the race. I think many people fell into that race trap, and they began using racist tropes against their detractors, which is exactly what they wanted to hear. That this is going to be formulated around division between Rivera and Khartoum and everybody else. And once you lose that link to the countryside, I think there's a big risk that your revolutionary impulse will die on the asphalt. So you don't move out of that asphalt road. You get stuck in the, and I think that's at the heart of in my mind, I mean, I might be completely wrong, but the way I understand how these merchant capital systems work is at least for now, I mean, there was a period, of course, in the 2000, when I was still in Sudan in the early 2000s, when Sudan had oil. So it didn't need really these rural production systems. It allowed them to be neglected. They were neglected, they were ignored. It didn't matter. You had a centralized system of production that involved a few technicians, a very small labor force, a very, very small labor force. And that you can guard this pipeline with a special police. And you had complete control of the system. You didn't really need anybody. It allowed the state to be independent. It could afford whatever it wanted, more or less, for some time. But now it has to rely on hyper-exploitation, which is an old story in Sudan's sort of record. This is not nothing new. And it's the ruling class will consolidate around this idea, because that's the only way it can satisfy its payment of credit balance. How is it supposed to work? How is it otherwise supposed to work? That's the option they have at hand. If somebody wants to get rid of this, then you need to think, what production system will you use? How would you get rid of these relations of exploitation? How will you, in Abdul Khaliq's word, how will you democratize the countryside? And I think without that idea, you will always be disappointed and upset about one politician or another.
True. Thank you so much for the elaboration.
Jump for a question.
Yeah. Ahmed has a question.
Yeah, I actually was, my question is actually to two of you, because also Muzan today wrote, I think in Twitter or Facebook, about political economies, access to understand. was happening there, and which you actually already elaborated on it, about the difference between the rural and the urban. But earlier there was also this thinking about civil disobedience and general strike as a tool from the revolution. As we see that civil disobedience and general strike, Muzan, and also to Magdi, I ask you first, like mostly the people who are contributing in that effort I've seen in the last 2 years, it's mostly working on the service sector, which is mostly from the urban, from the city, are not the people who are producing that. Can you describe for me how these tools could be matured in the second wave, and how these tools could be actually used as kind of to strike back, as based on the analysis that you made to create? And for this, my question to Muzan, and my question to Magdi, also you wrote, I think, 1 year and a half ago about the resisting committee, as the Sudanese revolution have delivered the resisting committee as an access node to geographical power. And this is also kind of resisting committee as this intersect between the urban and the city, and the power that get it from geographical Sudan. I want to describe for us in the same domain of this analysis, political economy, what is the resisting committee, what's the nature of this committee, and how in this game or in this political analysis that you made. And for Muzan, my question is about the strike and civil disobedience in this political economy analysis that you already wrote some of it also, Muzan. So I start with Muzan and then I go to this.
Sure. I think the answer is actually very simple. In my opinion, the tool matures when the organizations that are using it do. It's no secret that the level of organizing that we're seeing on neighborhoods level with resistance committees is much higher than the organizing that we have among labor organizations. It's not even comparable, and that was clearly reflected in the level of the tools that the neighborhood resistance committees use, which is the protests, the barricades, and so on. They were very successful over the past 3 weeks since the latest coup, while the strike is, it was great, but not even comparable. So I believe there's a lot of work for us to work on organizing on the labor front, and at least the short-term roadmap that I see in front of me for that is that in the same way that the SPA at its time lended its capacity and platform for the organizing of resistance committees as it started, and then it took on, it's now the work of the resistance committees to lend its capacity and platforms to the labor organizations for that to actually be formed. I think it's as simple as that. And just like a lot was done over 2 years on the resistance committees, but honestly, way more happened over the past 3 months, and that's just the 3 weeks, sorry, and that's basically just the circumstances led to an acceleration in organizing, an acceleration in the maturity of the resistance committees. They were pushed to that, but at least the base happened over the past 2 years. The same thing might happen with the labor organizations. We depending on the conditions and the capacity that the resistance committees and the masses within the working class will put in it. This is something that we can start to see fruits of it right now, but it also can be something that we will only see fruits of in the coming wave. And all of that, I say that to the level that I'm getting bored of it, but all of that can only actually put out something within the existence of a revolutionary party, which is, if things can be put in steps, is then the step after, not this one, maybe the next one, we'll see. But yeah, so basically better organizing at the labor front, and an actual revolutionary party that can cover the bases that neither geographic structure nor labor structures can do on their own.
Yeah.
Does that answer?
Yeah. Magdi?
Can you give me an easy question? I can't. It's difficult
I
thing.
think it's also based on, because I think I remember it was I remember it's like you talk about the existing committee as this a new thing that Sudanese revolution have delivered to kind of a revolutionary ideology in a way. How is that happen? And where is the existing committee from this urban ruler division that you wrote it in the last article about that Khartoum is exploiting a lot of, is what you call it, like importing a lot of what's called cosmetic stuff and not reducing. And I remember this from your article. So what is the resisting committee in this? Because when you talk about the power, you analyze the power, but what's about the movement? What's the resisting committee? So I don't want to see the future, I'm looking about the present in order to understand the future.
That's a very difficult question.
Sorry.
I mean, I don't know what you're getting at, Ahmed, but I think you want me to say something positive about the resistance committee. I think there's in form there is something very interesting in the resistance committee in form, which is that it's an open way of, for people who know the country, if you wanted to do politics in Sudan in the up to the 1960s, 70s, what were your options? The first option was you would look, what does your family's sort of patriarchal ties lead to? Under which gubba are they buried? Which sheikh do they respect? Where are your interests represented? Because these networks of these religious brotherhood networks were also networks of interests, land interests, business interests, merchant capital. They were also ways to access credit if you wanted to do some farming, for instance, or you wanted to export import, or you wanted somebody to sort of guarantee you a loan. So that's one way of doing, which would lead you to one of two patrician parties. You might know their names if you're interested in Sudan. The two biggest patrician parties in Sudan. They are structured around patrician figures. This was one way of doing politics. Another way, if you had an education, which was what very few people had, and people often forget this. Most people in Sudan understand nothing from what we're saying in this language we're speaking it. Do you get what I mean? You're talking not because they're stupid or because they don't understand, because you use a very different vocabulary to talk about politics. We use a very as me myself at least, I use a westernized vocabulary to talk politics. But if you're in a little hamlet in Kurdistan and you're talking politics, you don't express yourself the same way I'm expressing myself about politics. You don't talk about classes and structures and political economy and money and so on. You talk about families and family relations. That's very, very important. You talk about land ownership, which family owns land. And you talk about religious authority probably. Very recently, you talk about guns, because it involves a bit of violence. So you're using another dictum for politics. And that applies to the majority of Sudan's producers. They would use another dictum. The political dictionary is different. So one way of doing politics, as I said, is one of the patrician parties. Another way is that you would be educated. So you would be exposed in school to ideological currents. You could become a communist, or you could become a Muslim brother, or some weird people became Baathists, and others, more weird people became Nasrists and so on. So you catch this from education. So this is where it comes from. And these are two different networks. The educated, they don't do the mosques and the zikrs and the big social gatherings. They meet in the depth of the night and get drunk together and then talk about politics. And their world is reflected in this nightly drinking session. That's essentially where their political organizing happens. for many years. Or they, when there was not a lot of drinking, they sat together hours on end, hours after hours in some coffee shop or coffee, whatever, and talked forever. So it's a big talking culture. There's a lot of talking going on all the time. And that's your way of accessing politics. You need to have either this or that. And then in the 50s, the communists contributed the trade union, which meant that you could access political life through something very different. Had nothing to do with your religion or your geography or the family you came from. It was a democratic structure. You accessed it by virtue of being a member of a labor force. And it was revolutionary. It changed life for many people for a long period of time. It was truly revolutionary. And now I think the contribution of the resistance committee is that in form, it provided a new urban population. Most of it from the more radical elements of it are coming from the urban informal sector. These are the great radicals. Of course, there are radical students who come with ideas, but the radicals with ideas like myself end up sitting in Europe. But the radicals from the belly end up doing it, actually doing it, which is quite a different thing. I mean, they don't write about it and so on. But it's a necessity. You need to do it because that's the only way you would survive. You need to fight the police. It's not something you do in your spare time after you're forced to fight the police in a daily struggle. And if some structure gives you sort of an organizational capacity to fight the police better, then you're very happy. And that's where many people found themselves. And that's one reason why the resistance committee kept going, because it offered people coming from the highly exploited informal labor force in Khartoum. And what does this informal labor force mean? It's people who lay bricks on the banks of the river, people who sweep the streets, people who would be sort of be peddlers and traders on the streets. They would buy for very limited capital from a bigger merchant and then do distribution. People who do odd jobs, who one day would be a carpenter, the next day would be a launderer, the third day would be working in a restaurant, the fourth day would be stealing phones on the bus. So it's a system where you almost scavenge your life day by day. You don't have continuity in that. And of course they have very little to lose. That's why they're tough fighters. And they're ready to do a lot of protesting for a long time. And they don't mind getting killed. So this level of radicalism, the last time we've seen anything, at least, I mean, I'm a student of history. I'm not a revolutionary in any serious sense, except talking about it. The last time there was something this radical from a labor force in Sudan was probably in the 1950s, 1953, the Jude incidents, where people were sort of willing to take bullets for an issue like a rights issue, for a sort of a subsistence issue. It hasn't, this wave of radicalization is a long time ago. There was a lot of radicalization in the university world. So that's where the October impetus came. But radicalization in the workforce and on the street, it has been some time. And I think that's what the resistance committee contributes. But it could turn very reactionary too. Because in this environment, for instance, because there are no ideas, the 1953 trade union in Jordan or on the White Nile, or the people who did, or in the railways and so on, they were not deeply ideological, but they were inspired by some sort of communist idea. I mean, many of the trade unions I interviewed, for instance, would have read very little Marxist literature. My favorite is the guy who just read Mother, which is one of Gorky's books. That's all that he ever read. He just read, I read this book, and since then I became a communist. I found that wonderful. That's his only reading. He read nothing else. It's just a book by Gorky about the suffering of a mother. And that's it. That's where all the revolutionary impetus. And he said, that's explained the world to me. I don't need to know anymore. He died, unfortunately. But it tells you that once people are ready, from objective terms, radicalization doesn't take a lot. You can just give them a novel and they'll pick up. Now there's very little of that. And there was an incident, for instance, in 2000, in early 20 or late 19, I don't remember very well, when there were problems with bread shortages and distribution. And the same resistance committees who had sort of quite an emancipatory platform became caustically xenophobic. They actively attacked refugees in Sudan, which tells you something that Muzan sort of could explain better, is you can't guarantee the purity of form. If you need something to fill that with content. I mean, form alone will not satisfy. Muzan is speaking about the necessity for a party, which I mean, it's a very good idea. And there have been people talking about this for a long time, almost from the 19th. I mean, the renewal of the Revolutionary Party in Sudan is an issue. I mean, the first serious discussion of this is Shami Ahmed Abdel-Majid in '64. And then it has been coming up again and again each time. But I mean, that's not, I'm not prescriptive. I hate giving prescriptions. I can't do that. I can't do prescriptions. But I think you might want to think about why the party that does exist doesn't function. Not because its leadership is corrupt or its members are not anymore up to date or they don't read the right books, or that's not the explanation. I used to think for a long time there's an ideological explanation, but I think you need to think of it in political economy terms. Why does the party that does exist not function? In terms of political economy, what is this? My idea is that we have no organizational form for informal labor at all. We don't know how to organize informal labor. We haven't attracted informal labor in any serious sense. The same way as we haven't attracted agricultural labor. Agricultural labor ends up in the militia. If there are people with really radical drives in Sudan for transforming this system, it's agricultural labor. But I personally have I mean, maybe Muzan knows a bit more about this, but we know so little about agricultural labor in Sudan. There's a big wall between these worlds and they end up fighting you. The same kids who were shooting people on the streets, some of them would have come from this world of agricultural labor. And you need to think, I think you need to think very well about these contradictions, because that's where, you know, how success would happen. I mean, the Communist Party in the 50s was successful by 1964 because it had tapped in this popular radicalization. It had tapped into sources of popular radicalization. And you need to do, I think, a similar process has to happen today. But we live in a very different world where it's just too globalized. If you want to do revolution in Khartoum and build a revolutionary body in Khartoum, you need to make sure you do something in Abu Dhabi at the same time, or you're going to miss it. I think so. I mean, you need an ally in Abu Dhabi, otherwise it won't work. You need a very strong ally in Cairo.
You address a lot of issues. I actually
shut up then. Okay.
No. I don't want to shut up.
I think mentally you need to think about how you're defeated, because I think this is to be very honest. I mean, I don't like saying it loud, but I think this is a moment of great defeat, and you need to think very well how this happened. To my mind, this is a very deep counter-revolutionary moment. It's a moment where all these hopes are being dashed. People are demoralized.
It is, but I think also, I mean, now we're drifting off my prepared questions. Maybe is there a question from the audience directly to that? Or because I wanted to ask you, I mean, all the other, I mean, now we addressed Abu Dhabi and Cairo and I think what else can we say, like
Israel.
Israel and yeah, also like Moscow, whatever. But for example, now what I think is always a question to ask is that the West has shown ultra counter-revolutionary behavior as well and actions. And I mean, the typical question we would always ask people, and I think you heard them a lot, is what can we here in the diaspora do? How can we, like, stop our governments from collaborating with people like Hamdok and, like, these patriarchal structures in Sudan? I know maybe it's a not that difficult question. Do you have an answer to that?
Is that to me?
To you or to Muzan maybe?
No, I think you should ask Muzan. She knows much better than me about this.
Muzan, what would you say, or what can we do here? Because also we're kind of running out of time. And maybe that would be a good, I have a last question I want to ask you, but I will ask you that after this. So maybe now the question would be, what can we do here? Or like, not what we, that's such a stupid question, but like, what would you suggest us, or what would you like to see from us, or like our role?
Well, there are the abstract answers that, as Magdi said, it's a global counter-revolutionary front, and we need a global revolutionary front. I mean, that goes without saying, and it will happen probably in rounds. We are hoping that not many of our coming rounds will take us backwards, but just like a few steps forwards. And if the region takes us a few steps forward, we'll be able to move on. And if you take a few steps forward, we'll be able to have bigger steps the next time. So that's just the abstract form of it. In general, and I'm gonna be very like tactical about what's happening just right now, because I don't think any of us lacks the capacity to figure out the abstract long-term roadmap, but just sharing some of what's happening over here and what's tactically needed right now. The way in which the situation in Sudan is presented, and whether it's like think tank policy papers or mainstream media, or sometimes not even very mainstream media, they keep on failing or just deciding not to mention the actual organizers on the ground. I think what happened, for example, what happened on Sunday shows that it's not just like the think tanks outside, it's whoever are the think tanks that are talking to Hamdok and his coup team right now. They seem to have no idea what's happening on the ground. It was a huge PR failure, a very stupid move to announce the deal during the agreement. Their lives would have been much easier and ours would have been much harder if they done that, for example, during the internet shutdown, or just at a time where people are not in the street together and can come up with, for this, general consensus to take place. But that they did. And this thing about always missing on the existence of the resistance committees right now, for example, and the use of phrases such as pro-democracy activists, they just really do not want to see that there is organized bodies, or like they just do not want to reflect that. And if that's what they don't want to show, I think that's our job to show that there is organized resistance. It's not to the level that we would like it. It's not to the level that it requires for an actual revolutionary move forward to take place, but it is there and it needs to be acknowledged. So I think everybody with the platform needs to highlight that. Everybody with the platform needs to highlight the counter-revolutionary role of international diplomats in Sudan directly. Again, I'm just being tactical. There is, of course, investors' money, UAE and the gold, Morocco and the land. That is there, but tactically, who's currently in Sudan making speeches? There's Volker, Magdi's dear friend, the special representative of the UN General Secretary. those people needs to be targeted. And it was clear to me, at least over the past weeks, that when they were directly targeted and cursed by usually very polite Sudanese public, they retreated a bit on their public statements. And when they do that, those statements are used in the messaging to the public to show that, see, the Khawajat like this, it must be a very good thing. And like, so to be able to stop them from doing that is a good thing. So it's always good to target them. And then just honestly, this, I think there's a value to it, but because I cannot fully justify it to you, so I'm just going to put it out as a personal request that I really would like to understand what Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is doing in Sudan and the amount of money they like channeled through lobbying for the labor laws and the union laws and the involvement of their man in Sudan in the latest initiative. So like, just take that as a personal request from me. And if anybody can do the research, since you have some freedom of information, and figure out where that money is going, where it's coming from. And then from our side, we'll try to figure out what it's actually doing in the country. I just have a feeling that will be a big step forward.
I mean, I can tell you, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is like the SPD run, and SPD is like the party of our foreign minister. So I think that explains a lot, but it's
I'd love more details. I would really love more details on that. Just a bit more details on the money will be great, actually.
But that's a good point. So maybe we'll stage our next protest in front of them.
Oh, that would be awesome. Take photos for me, guys.
Yeah, we can put like a puppet with a picture of you, so you can be physically there.
Oh wow,
we'll do that. Yeah, so maybe the last question, Magdi, I hope you still have some minutes left for us.
Yes, you could. You're welcome to ask if you have a question.
Okay, this is now coming to our installation, because I mean, you guys will probably not have a chance to see it. We will send you pictures and videos and everything, but we have an installation of a barricade because when we planned everything, the internet was still shut, and we had this, also kind of emotional urge, I think, to really like amplify voices from Sudan and from the streets, you know, although we're also all part of one city, I guess, and like one, also you can call it class, which I think is always important for us to mention. And yeah, so we collected voice messages from friends and family, brothers, sisters, and whatever. And as a personal question to you at the end, what do the barricades mean to you? And what do you associate with them? What emotions come up when you, like, you know, think of a barricade? Typically in Sudan, somewhere.
Is that to me?
To you first, and then maybe to Muzan.
No, I'm not suitable for this. You can ask Muzan for sure.
You don't have any emotions coming
I don't
up?
have any emotions. No,
Okay.
no. Ask
Been too
Muzan.
long.
She has the right experience.
Yeah, I think Muzan, you have your eyes are not tired of barricades now. You've seen them a lot. So
when there are barricades in the streets, people walk differently. They walk like they own the streets. And that's what I like about when we have barricades. It seems like, and there's this chant that says, "Al-Balad di haqqatna," which means like that this country is ours. And it just feels a bit more real when there are barricades around. And that's what barricades make me feel like. We close it when we want to. It's not very true though. You can still get harassed around barricades, but it's a step forward.
thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for, first of all, answering my questions and also elaborating on everything, and the very, very precious input. And now I would say we have some time left for our audience. If there's any questions, do you have any questions? Maybe also to other people. This is like opening up the plenum now. Should we switch on the light again? Because I feel like, okay, that's great, because we can't see anything. Yes, please.
This is wonderful and inspiring of so many levels. I'm from Beirut, Lebanon, so much of what we had in 2019 Sudan was always in our heart and mind, actually. When the October uprising began in Lebanon.
Can you come to the front because you didn't hear, right? Majdi and
I
Muzan
heard
didn't
nothing.
hear.
I heard some
Okay.
mumbling.
So thank you so much for this. This has been very inspiring on so many levels. I'm from Beirut, Lebanon, and in October 2019, Sudan was really on our heart and mind in every single step. And much of the chants that came out of Beirut were directed to Sudan. We failed in creating a similar professionals association that could have actually helped us to mobilize better across different labor sectors. But there's something that's really stunning to me that really writing down notes right now regarding this notion of we need the global revolutionary movement to fight a counter-revolutionary movement. But much of what both of you discussed really has to do with looking at the counter-revolutionary forces on domestic level, not only on a regional level or international level. Much of the friction that both of you described eloquently, and I have pages of notes, and I'm going to email you both and follow you on Twitter to keep this conversation alive, because there's much that we need to learn from Beirut, because we are at the point right now of defeat, and we want to get out of this defeat. But my question, very pointed to both of you, is how to really reconcile this, the notion of being in exile, which both of you to a certain extent alluded to, thinking about these networks, thinking about the internationalization of the counter-revolution in Sudan, but also coming to terms with the friction, the miscommunication, the gaps that exist within the country, and not only within different classes, but also across different regions, how we think about labor. And I love the point about we're using a different political dictionary, which is the point that we very strongly felt, and I happen to be in the ivory tower, unfortunately. So this is something we've faced from the very first days of the uprising in Beirut, which is you're speaking a different language. You're speaking something completely alien to us, and we never were able to circumvent that. So if you can talk more about this notion of complicating the local, because the global is important, the regional is important. You have tough neighbors, we have tough neighbors as well, right? And it seems this intersectionality of struggles really has to begin, as you're both saying, from a bottoms-up approach, which really has to do with finding a commonality in discourse. But how do you do that in practice? And I'm really not asking a difficult question because I don't have an answer to it. So any thoughts that we can think of collectively would be interesting in order to build this synergy, because Berlin is a great city for doing that to a large extent, but also because we are thinking about this on a daily notion, right? This is a form of daily violence in our mind, in our hearts when it comes to being able to continue the fight. So any thoughts, random, as broad, as abstract, as theoretical, as practical, it's up to you both, but really thinking out loud with you and the group here in Berlin, what is one way of beginning to shape this commonality and discourse? Because this has become not only a problem for the left, but also a problem broadly speaking when it comes to connecting with what we consider to be the local public. And I know this might be difficult, but I really don't have an answer. But if you have anything that you'd share with us, I would be very thankful. So thank you again for this wonderful, wonderful, inspiring shared set of reflections.
You can stay, Jim.
It's a very difficult question. But I mean, I don't have an answer to your question. I think it's a very good one. I just can't answer it. I think one way I try to think about these things is to study popular culture. And with this, I mean everyday speech, jokes, songs, idioms, names of streets, the names of foods, eating behavior, sort of ritual changes that happen. So to more from the anthropological world, not from dated anthropology, like contemporary, like to look at contemporary life with an anthropological eye. And I think that helps you bind some of these, create some of these relations, especially if you think, for instance, I learned quite a lot from studying the history of Dhura in Sudan, which is Dhura شنو اسمها يا
Corn.
لا ما كون شنو
What is it?
ما كون sorghum, the history of long
okay.
sorghum. And sorghum, and it's I think that one of the most important books I ever read about Sudan is a book about fermented foods. It's called The Fermented Foods of Sudan. And it tells the story of meals. It takes you from the street inside the home. And all of what we're saying happens in the public domain. So the barricade, the sort of the organizing, the trade union, all this is in the public domain. But this type of thinking takes you into private lives, into homes. And that's a very important place to start off if you want to link the local and the global. Because this is the shared experience of all peoples, is what they do at home. And what enters their home, what element of that globality enters their home, what makes it into their everyday life. And you can learn quite a lot about that by studying things from popular culture. For instance, I tracked down, it took me some time to work this out, but I tracked down the beginning of the use of the word Arab in Sudan. When did people begin using this word? It was always a mystery to me. When did they start calling themselves Arab? And it took me really into private life. It emerged out of, I mean, I can't explain it all to you. It would take a lot of time to explain it now, but you need to go very far into private life through items from popular culture. So if I was in your shoes, I would think of studying something, a common item, a common commodity in Lebanon that made global fame, that is globally important. Something that Lebanon makes. Who makes it? How is it made? Who makes money out of it? Who sells it? Who trades it? And how is it presented to the world? And this tells you something about the linkages of the local to the global. And it tells you this through a materialist analysis and not through some humbug culture nonsense. It gives you a materialist base for understanding that link. And because you will understand it through cycles of trade and networks of trade and exchange. And it will bring you close to labor too, because all this involves production. Somebody puts an energy into it. So if I would spend more time studying items from popular culture. And as you know, all these things require a lot of thinking. There's no ready-made, you won't find a ready-made formula for this in book format anywhere. I don't know. If you find something like this, give it, please hand it. But it doesn't exist. You need to really think it through. And especially in this new world we live in, where things are, for instance, I understood quite a lot about Sudanese trade relations when I found bottled milk from Saudi Arabia in a place in North Kordofan. It was very astonishing to find bottled milk from Saudi Arabia in a place from North Kordofan. And it got me thinking about how did this happen? How is it that in a fridge that drives on a refrigerator, I'll find some milk from Saudi Arabia in a place that does nothing else except milk? Why is milk from Saudi Arabia cheaper than milk locally produced in Kordofan? How does that happen? So and then you sort of start working your way through, but you have to begin with an item. And of course, if you're a reader of Marx, he begins with a commodity, with an abstraction of the commodity. And you should essentially do the same game by beginning with something that something identifiable. That's a very long answer to your, a long comment to your also very long comment. So I'll stop here before I lose myself.
Unfortunately, Muzan has left us. Maybe there was a power cut or something.
Sure, come on.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we close now with this piece of actually. If somebody have a question.
Is there another question?
Yeah. Ask?
Would you come to the front?
Yeah,
So
sure. I would like to just build on what you mentioned. What's your name, sorry?
Jeffrey?
Jeffrey mentioned towards the beginning of his comment, which referred to what you said about having an ally in Egypt and in a place like the UAE, because we all have like knowledge about how difficult the situation is there security-wise, and how difficult it is for people to mobilize around such issues. So I would like you to talk more about this thing of building coalitions in places like that, and activating an internationalist sort of coalition as part of what is being done right now on the ground.
That's a very good question, but I mean, I'm not sure if I can really satisfy your, I mean, if it's about the UAE, I think you probably read some of the literature around that. The main issue in the Gulf is that you need to move away from nationality and talk about labor, and then you will find your ally. Your ally is in a very broad and massive labor population in these countries. That's your ally. Now, how is this labor captured? How is it maintained? How does it work? Is another. But you need to move away from nationality, and I think you need to also remember. And you're in a very highly globalized city, Berlin. You need to remember that at the beginning of communism, at the beginning of sort of where communism began to become a bit of a serious story, one of its main elements was internationalism. And then that issue sort of began to weaken over the years until you had the idea of it. And there was a period of time where a revolutionary would be a transhuman migrant. You could get the same individual working in different countries. Nationality wouldn't be a deterrent. The first cells of organization in France were not by French workers or by German workers. So it's and the same applies to English in Marxist time. Now, what I'm trying to say in short is you should look at systems of production, and in the UAE and in these Gulf countries, you've got a massive internationalist labor force. It's internationalist by its very composition, but how do you work among them? How do you radicalize? How do you torch that? I mean, this has to become an intrinsic necessity. You can't export revolutionary changes. That won't work. There has to be an intrinsic demand for this. And I think some of that was seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Gulf countries began shedding off labor. And then you had a movement in Lebanon and also in some Gulf countries, at least in Kuwait, functioning around domestic labor. And it turned out that domestic labor was the more advanced element in that labor system in terms of awareness and the rights language. But they were using a very rights-based language. It was all around rights, around human rights, I mean. And it would have been, I think it's interesting to see in which direction that would evolve and how you could feed into such because they make the homes in these countries. I mean, they do social reproduction. So they do something even more deeper and more important than the everyday, the material production. They do social reproduction, which is sort of the inner life of any society is around social reproduction. And this is outsourced to internationalist domestic labor, people from multiple nationalities. You will find all sorts of nationalities in a country like in a city like Dubai. Imagine you had a revolutionary party in Dubai. It would be quite interesting what would happen there. But I think that's where you shouldn't deem that as impossible. This situation is not sustainable in the Arab Gulf, and it's a place where at least for the Middle East, where the heart of counter-revolution is today. These are the capitals of counter-revolution. And I mean, in Nasser's time, Nasser infected places like Yemen and Saudi Arabia and some of these Kuwaiti countries with Nasserite ideas, sort of these petty bourgeois revolutionary ideas, came from Nasser's era. And this is one reason why he had such a hold on the Arab world, because he could hit into the hard capitals of counter-revolution. He could strike hard right into their capitals, which today is not possible, because I think people are not winning the world, the war of hegemony. They're not doing enough hegemonic work, which means that you need to spread your ideas. You need to talk about them all the time, and propagate. I mean, it's not only about building. Of course, you need that. At some point, there has to be a movement, a revolutionary movement in sense. But first, you need to win people's minds, which means that when a domestic, I mean, in practical terms, what does that mean? When a domestic worker goes on strike in a place like Beirut, what language would she use? If she uses the language of human rights, you still haven't achieved hegemony. If she uses the language of labor, then we're getting there. So you're getting closer. Your language, your ideas about how society works and functions are becoming popular enough that somebody who is carrying on a struggle that might appear as minimal, not so important, it's not sort of world changing, is using that language to express where his problem is. In this case, what her problem is. So I think it's you're asking a very important question, and there's nobody who can't really contribute to that in any way. I think people could seriously contribute to that if they wanted to. I mean, unless you think all this is an impossibility, but if you think there's a big chance, even 1 in a million, 1 in 10 millions, 1 in 100 million, that this might even barely function in some way, then that's probably how it would work, I think.
Thank you.
Is there another question? Like the last one?
We can close. I think
If
this
not,
was
then
enough as a-
yes. I mean, it's just a pity Muzan is still not here, but
She's not online.
she's not online yet. That means probably the interactive is not working. Anyway, Magdi, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, that's very kind of you. That's very kind of you. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for just taking the time, even though you said you have to leave at 8. Always sorry for.
That's
that
my
was
way of
just-
leaving. That's my way of leaving at 9. Is to tell
Okay,
you.
perfect. You're a mastermind indeed. Thank you so much. And then, yeah, for our beautiful audience, the installation is downstairs. We'll stick around for quite a while. I mean, downstairs in the basement, if you're not familiar with this place. Yeah, we'll stick around here for quite a while, and then the next days, you might find some of us around, or maybe not. But yeah, thank you, Magdi.
Awesome. All right then. Bye bye. Take care. Bye bye. All of you.
Bye. Yeah.